Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and today I want to make a piece of new player content to help give people kind of a little bit of a better idea about how to go about kind of setting up and thinking about your initial pulls and thinking about what element maybe you want to play. Maybe even thinking about it in that way is a little bit outdated. But there are really strong elemental synergies to this game still. You may also want to look into job-based vision cards and job-based synergies as well. Some of these are very powerful. But that being said, I think one of the easiest ways to look at this game is to look at each element, how they fare against each other. And in the past, I have done a series of videos that was very new player focused, where I looked at all the characters in each element. And that video is still pretty good. It is missing all of the newer characters from the last number of months since I released that, and there are some other things that I would say about some of the characters that are already on there, given the way that the meta has changed a bit. But today I want to look at each element and kind of give a little bit of an overview about how they play and what makes them good, and which ones you should consider maybe building older units for, or building towards if you're getting started today, and kind of how you should think about the elements as they stand. I will be giving a bit of history, much like I did in the Get to Know an Element series, but the ratings, which I'm going to be giving a 1 out of 10 rating for each element, those are going to be based pretty primarily on how they function now, and typically in PvP. There are, and I am going to mention PvE strategies and elements that are really good for PvE content, but honestly, a lot of PvE content can be beaten by basically any element. Some elements will do better, some elements do better against specific bosses, etc. Some elements have really good chaining potential, i.e. maybe light and dark, but there are others as well. And usually the biggest challenge in this game is other players, not developer content. So PvE tends to be something that you can build up and beat with whatever your chosen element is. PvE is where it becomes really important to be thinking about which of these is going to fare the best in combat. So let's get started with what do you think is one of the most common elements. This is also an element that, to its credit, gets a lot of free support. For instance, let me just point out the free units here. Here's Bart's, Addison Rae, Hope. I had the top 8 units here. 3 of them already were free units. And then we've got Locke and Lucio here on this next one. Camilo. I think Cecil was free on his first release. Anyways, oh shit. Also, Thancred, but we don't talk about Thancred. Thancred is terrible. So they have that going for them. They also have a lot of limited cost units, especially, and they've had them for a while. Some of these are aging more and more poorly, and I really think that this is becoming less of a benefit of this element. Units like Phoebe and Fina were really, really powerful for MR and SR units. I think Phoebe for the longest time was by far the strongest SR unit and the most useful, but I think that a lot of that utility has kind of faded over time, especially as a lot of other characters have been updated to be a little bit more standout than she is. The same thing has kind of happened to Fina. Like, she peaked really early, probably around the same time that Jaden came out here, so like right before the era of Lucio and Locke, and I'm just saying, they could definitely use some updating in that respect. And also, looking at the elemental list, I'm pretty sure that they're the only element that has not received a free-to-build MR character at all. There's none. Some elements have actually received like 2 by now. Fire has Kamral and Ruvelka. Not a single one for light. I think that's really something that they need. I don't think that it's something that they needed. I think that it kind of makes sense to put them last for that, because they did have such good MR, SR, and 70 cost units from the very beginning. Also, really strong 70 cost unit here in Miranda as well. If you're looking for something more limited cost, but you still want to go UR. Also, the original Lucio is quite powerful as well as a free unit. He's only 80 cost, so that's actually makes him a real discount compared to a lot of these other characters, most of which are 100 cost, some of which are 80 cost. And then I think there's also Hope and these two. So, other benefits to this element, Helena the Black Rose is very powerful right now, probably one of the most meta units, and a huge credit to this element. Lucio, Light of Brilliance, is also pretty powerful. I haven't felt super intimidated by him in Arena, but on the right team, he definitely puts in work. I really don't think that he's a superstar necessarily, but he's pretty good for a 100 cost unit. He has a lot of select 2 abilities, so that's always pretty neat to see, but I don't know, I just haven't been impressed by him in Arena yet, which is a little unfortunate. Bartz and Addison Rae are both pretty incredible for free units. Not much more I can say about that. It feels like Light is just typically an element that gets a lot of free benefits, and when you think about it as being like aligned with the heroic, when you think about Final Fantasy as being a franchise where you often talk about the Warriors of Light and things like that, then obviously Light is going to tend to be a little bit stacked. It's also worth talking about the way that the elemental pie works out, because of the 6 basic elements, other than Light and Dark, they each have a weakness and a strength. And for Light and Dark, their weaknesses and their strengths are each other. So they're not exactly weak to each other, they just have a very explosive matchup. And there are ways to build like a Light team that's anti-Dark, or a Dark team that's anti-Light, and it would be really interesting to see what would happen if, both of those go up against each other. But you have a more even footing against the counter element than you would with a lot. So there's one thing that Light and Dark both enjoy is that there's typically not a super easy way to counter them. You need to think about the mechanics of their team, you need to understand how that team works, and then counter that. And that's often more difficult than just throwing the counter element at it, which is a really simple way of playing this game against a lot of teams. Let me think. Are there any like big downsides to Light though? I mean, other than missing that like 50 cost free to build MR unit, which I think is really helping a lot of other elements, especially in limited content. These guys have a lot going on, and not for nothing, Engelbert is a really powerful 70 cost tank. As time goes on, because he was one of the first units and one of the first real tanks in the game, I find him harder and harder to use effectively, especially with his glaring weakness to magic, although typically magic stays a bit to the fringes of the meta, so that's good for him. He's aged incredibly well, but despite that, I would say that he's probably still best in limited content where you need those extra 30 points for something else. I wouldn't necessarily run him on a full cost team anymore, but he is a pretty good tank. So, a lot of good things here, not many downsides, hard to elementally counter. They're not necessarily in the best place right now, but I think that's probably true of a lot of the elements. Like, it feels a little bit more balanced in some ways. There's a couple elements that I feel are still kind of bad, but they're at least trying at the very least. But all of that being said, I think that Light is probably the strongest element. It's probably the safest element to start in, and probably the element where you're most likely to see free benefits into the future more consistently than others. At least that's how it has been in the past. So, I'd say that Light would probably have to score an 8 out of 10. It's just a very good element. It has a really good champion right now in Helena the Black Rose, and it has a lot of strong characters that can support her as well. Now, that's not necessarily the best way to use Helena the Black Rose, but we are starting to enter a point in the game where mixed element compositions, due to the virtue of their combined strengths and synergies, and mixed element compositions that rely on job-based vision cards and synergies, are actually becoming way more viable. So there are other ways of looking at this game than just elementally, and that's kind of a detriment to all of the elements in a way, because I would love to give Light more points for Helena the Black Rose, but I don't necessarily think that her best place necessarily is on a Light team, so I have to dock a little bit there. So again, I think 8 out of 10 is pretty fair, and this is maybe the most solid element in the game. Looking at Dark, there's a number of really good standout units that have come out pretty recently. Roth is quite powerful, but she did get a little bit overshadowed. But again, like, there aren't many other tanks that can do what she can do. She is a very, very modern tank. There's maybe only like 2 or 3 other tanks that hold up as well as her, but it also maybe isn't the best place for tanks right now. Vivi is incredible, but he's a limited unit. He has the ability to protect re-raise, which is really important right now. He can also stun lock people with his LB. He's basically the ideal partner for Helena the Black Rose, which is why I said that, you know, there are some synergies outside of Light that make her work well, but at the same time, like, a pure Dark team probably isn't as strong as a Light and Dark team that utilizes both of them. So they kind of have to lose some points for that in Vivi and even Raph as well. Now, Vivi and Raph are going to work perfectly well within Dark too, and probably one of their better partners here is Sephiroth, who has been just an absolute powerhouse since he came out. That being said, and this is a pattern that I've noticed with FFB and Sephiroth specifically, is that he tends to be a real powerhouse when he comes out, but in a way that's kind of vanilla, that loses a little bit of the technical aspects of the game. And it's just kind of brute force in a way. And one of the biggest examples of this is Sephiroth's LB, which has a huge area of effect and can also remove courage and re-raise. But you only get one cast of that. If he were to get a second cast of that so that he could hit 2 teams with it in the case of Guild Battle, then maybe it would be able to keep up. But there's a lot of newer units, like I'm thinking about Alaya the Alabaster, Kamral, who have ways of not only removing courage on their hits for multiple turns, but also the ability to give that to allies. And since we've seen that, that's just been a much more effective way than trying to rely on one cast of Sephiroth's Limit Break, and some other parts of him are kind of fading. But he is still quite a solid unit. He is still relatively new, so he's pretty good. Lunacestus Catone is probably one of my favorite new units. Even though she's only a 70 cost, I haven't been the hugest fan of newer 70 cost units, but she's pretty good. Let's see. And then going a little bit older, Dark Fina is also a pretty cool character. Black-robed Witch Helena dominated the meta when she was first released. She's definitely fallen off, and basically her and everything below her has kind of fallen off as well. Although Stern Knight of Ruin also has his moments sometimes. But this speaks to Dark having a powerful and storied history. They're also really good for PvE. I would say Light is as well. Light Slash and Dark Slash, both respectively, are an incredible chaining power for PvE content. I would say that probably Light has some of the newer Slash units, as there aren't as many in this top. Like, there's only these 2. Everybody else has a different damage type up here. Here's another one, here's another one, here's another one. Dark used to be a lot more Slash based, and the Dark Slash team is still quite powerful and has a lot of chaining potential. So good for PvE. It also has the advantage that Light has, where it doesn't have a direct counter, that has kind of a one-way efficiency against it. So these teams can be really hard to counter, and if you don't necessarily know what else to do, a Dark team is always pretty good for that reason, especially if you have some of the better characters. That being said, I would say that especially right now, Dark is falling a little bit behind Light. It does have a number of lower cost units. It did get Raynell, but she's a little bit older, so they've got that free to build MR unit that's pretty good. But she's one of the older ones. I don't think she's one of the better ones. Maybe they deserve a new one by now. They don't tend to get as many free units. That was a thing that I gave Light a little bit of bonus points for, and I think Gafgarian was free? Maybe? I don't know. So you're not really going to get that with Dark, but it does kind of have a privileged position. It does come into power quite often, and it usually is towards the top of the pack. It's not always like at the tippity top of the power level, but it's usually pretty near the top, and it's usually pretty consistent in that way, and that's pretty special. I think I'm going to give this one say a 7 out of 10. And one of the main reasons I'm saying 7 out of 10 is Lunicestus, Catone, Vivi, Roth, Sephiroth. These are the strongest units that have been released recently for Dark, and you'll notice a commonality. They're all limited units. There really aren't good non-limited units for Dark right now. And like even looking at the most recent 8 released, there is literally only one of them. The 70 cost Bronwell, who was released super late on global, really kind of missed the mark. That's non-limited. And then looking further down, I mean, you have Lilith Bold, Dark Fina. Those are both pretty good options and kind of a solid sub-tier for Dark. They'll definitely fill in the holes. If you have 2 out of 3 of the other units in one of them, they'll do fine. And then Renelle was free and unlimited herself, but I think that kind of holds it back. Like, if you have the limited units to play Dark, it is very good, and it's pretty consistent and has remained consistent throughout the game, as opposed to some of the other, like, tertiary elements who can be a little bit all over the place. So definitely a very solid 7 out of 10 here. Next up, let's talk about Lightning. We've gotten a number of new Lightning units recently. Lightning has had a lot of power pumped into it. However, I think a number of the characters have kind of missed the mark. And it's really unfortunate because Lightning has a number of the most iconic Final Fantasy characters and protagonists specifically. We've got Cloud, fan favorite Esther from FFBE, Lightning, even Alphonse from Full Metal Alchemist, Squall, all of these characters, and a lot of them just, they're okay. They're pretty good, but they tend to fall apart against more well-built teams. I'm not saying you can't win with Lightning. I was a Lightning player before anything else but really Light. I wanted to play for Yuna when she came out, so that started me into Light, and then I eventually drifted over into Lightning for Squall, or I'm sorry, not for Squall, for Cloud, and that was a little bit unfortunate. Back in her day, Lightning was very powerful because she bucks a lot of the trends of Lightning. She was even powerful against Earth. Difficult challenger for Earth teams because of her ability to add non-elemental damage to her attacks for a set number of turns, but also because she's fairly accurate. So she can deal with the kind of evasion tricks that Earth can throw at her, but also the elemental resistances that Earth has as well. There's also Skahal, who's done really well at certain times, especially once he got Auto Courage, but he kind of needs a healer to work with him. Resnick was that for a while, and she did really well for a long time, but I would say that her time is probably over. There was a time when Resnick held up a lot better. She was just really good support for a very long time, but she's always had a bit of an issue with taking hits, and her lack of durability is only getting more and more aggravating and making her more and more difficult to play. She is a strong support if you can keep her away from damage, but unfortunately a thing that a lot of Lightning units share is that they're just not very resilient. Even if they tend to do a lot of damage, they don't tend to be able to take it very well. Cloud being one of the first and a pretty excellent example of that. He's good at dealing range damage. He's very good at taking out especially water characters. He even had some kit to be able to deal with evasion back in the day. But the rest of his kit was kind of vanilla and doesn't really add anything to his power level. Like, his attacks just don't do many other things. And that's kind of power crept him out of relevance. But also, I mean, from the very beginning, seeing Squall versus Squall, it was whoever got in range to deal damage to the other first, because they were going to one-hit each other. And a lot of things one-hit Cloud, unfortunately, including Cloud himself. Squall was a bit of an improvement. He is certainly more resilient. I'm not sure that he has quite the same damage, relatively speaking. And I'm not sure that his shielding ability is quite as good as... I mean, he was new. A lot of things in this game get hyped when they're new because it's a new type of thing. Everybody wants it. Everyone wants to play with it. But I just don't think it was all that strong. And this guy was kind of strategically a miss. Also, Vigo was pretty decent, but he really has a hard time fitting into this element and being good, unfortunately. And a couple of the issues that this element has in general is that it's just not very accurate. Now, this is a pretty big deal because, with the exception of like Lightning and Alaya the Alabaster, most of these units have a lot of trouble hitting the broadside of a barn without help. And that means that evasion teams of basically any element can feel free to often cheese Lightning. Also, Lightning tends to, especially when it goes all physical, be pretty bland. And those bland physical teams can get walled pretty hard. This is another thing that Earth does incredibly well, not just because of the elemental advantage, but because they tend to wall physical teams pretty easily themselves, especially inaccurate ones. Which means that Earth evasion is a perfect counter to 90 to 99% of everything Lightning is and ever will be. The upsides to this element, though, is that they have a very strong strike core. And in limited content, Alaya the Alabaster, Alphonse, and Lisette or Slime make a pretty excellent strike team. Also, Winter Roth is a lot stronger than I thought she would be. She is a very good support who can also do some pretty ridiculous damage, and also just has a lot of utility crammed into her kit. For being a limited cost unit, she's very good. And Alaya the Alabaster, if you've watched any of my content, you'll know that she's basically been the best character in this game since she was released. So you would think that things like this would give Lightning a lot of advantages. Also, Astrius the Erudite Bolt, super cool looking character, super built up and like cool within the story, but in my testing, he just has not held up like some of the other Lightning units do. And that's weird because it seems like you can stack a lot of types of barriers and damage resistance on this guy, and even with that, he's just not quite tanky. Also doesn't do quite as much damage as you want him to, and when he is tanky, it's only for the first couple of hits, and then all of a sudden it falls apart. So he's a little bit awkward, and there's just a lot of awkward Lightning units in that way. I'm not saying that a team of like Astrius, Vega, Alphonse, Raph, Alaya, like these type of units, maybe even Lightning, can't work together and win some matches, but it's been, and this is kind of a, I'm sorry Lightning players that I'm saying this in a video, but whenever like I have a light team or just a good versus physical team or something, and I don't have an obvious advantage that I can exploit, the teams that I tend to go for easy pickings are Lightning teams. They've just been kind of underwhelming for a long time, and I'm sure there are great players out there who can build a hell of a Lightning team that could even beat most of my shenanigans, but in my practical experience, they've been pretty few or far between. That said, compared to some of the other elements here, there's a lot of potential, and while you do have to cherry pick the units a bit to build a strong team here, there are strong teams here. So I have a hard time giving this a really low rating, even though I think it's been a pretty reliable one to pick on for a long time. That being said, though, a number of the newer units don't have some of the problems that Lightning has had in the past. Like, for instance, being particularly squishy, we've got Alphonse, Vega, Alaya, to a certain extent Squall, Astrius to a certain extent as well, and even Roth in a way. All of these are pretty resilient characters. You also have Alaya the Alabaster, Vega, Lightning, all three of these characters are particularly accurate. Alphonse also has a way of doing guaranteed hit damage that heals him and just really hits quite hard. So there's a bit of accuracy in here. I guess what I'm saying is that if you have the newest Lightning units, you probably fare a lot better than Lightning has historically, but Lightning definitely has some issues. The one thing that Lightning doesn't have an issue dealing with, though, is water. This is the elemental weakness of Lightning, so of course it tends to get beat by it pretty heavily. Also, it tends to be a bit more magically based and a bit more physically weak, so the vanilla Lightning teams don't have to do a lot to be able to beat most water teams, at least historically. There have been some proud moments for for water, and to be honest with you, there's a lot of characters in here that I absolutely love, and if you're careful in how you play a water team, they can be really dominant, because against certain things, especially against magic teams, as there tends to be a lot of anti-magic within water, also a lot of healing and support. There was a long time where in guild battle I would end my second fight with 6 stars and a fully healed team just because there was enough resilience and support to really make it through. That being said, there's a lot of curveballs that can absolutely ruin things for a water team, and I'm seeing a lot more water teams, a lot more competitive water teams running an extra element with them. Also, they have one of the best tanks in the game right now. I would say that Summer Glaciella is probably the strongest tank that we currently have access to. Quite a powerhouse. We still see her a lot to this day. I mean, she's not particularly old, but Summer was a little while ago. Ferris also just does a lot. She can support and or heal while attacking and do those things to multiple people. That's pretty excellent. She's one of the few characters with sequence abilities. This is something that also makes Helena of the Black Rose quite cool. Elda, King of the Lions, also has a sequence ability that's pretty hard to use, honestly, in testing to its full benefit, but it's cool. It's cool. He's not bad. But for most of those characters, those are LB effects. Ferris actually has these within her kit, so they're repeatable for her in a way that they aren't for other characters. Also, the Astria Celeste era for water was also really powerful. That being said, also Perrine is quite a tough cookie, although I don't think that water is really where she excels. There was a period before there was like a full strike team available to where Astrius, Perrine, and Celeste was really strong, but it's always been relatively easy to counter. Like, somehow water just always misses the mark by not having much resistance to physical teams, typically. And since the meta is typically way more physical, this really puts them on a bad playing field with basically everyone most of the time. They are really good at anti-magic, though. You'll find a lot of good anti-magic characters here. It's unfortunate that that's not usually a bigger, stronger part of the meta, but water does excel in that way. So if you're a smart player, you can definitely play water to be incredibly powerful. But at the same time, I would say that its general matchups are kind of lacking. That being said, all of that aside, recently, probably even more than Lightning, there have been a lot of cool characters injected into this element. Elda, Gernsback being a discount choice, Ferris, Glaciella, all of these I just mentioned. Perrine, even though I don't think that water is really where she excels, and even Astrius and Celeste still kind of hold up. Veritas of the Waters looks like she's going to be good, but I'm not even sure that anyone in JP has her at this point in fighting shape, so, knowing how she's going to fit into the meta exactly on the global side is basically impossible at this moment, but she is the newest water unit. And unfortunately, I'm not a big fan of Shadowlinks the Crystalborn, and I'm really not a fan of ranged units in general. But, so water is a little bit on and off in that it's really good against what it's good against, and it's pretty bad against what it's bad against. I just think there's a lot of things that it's bad against, and maybe even more than lightning. And, you know, while they do have Summer Glaciella and Ferris, and they're quite a power couple, they don't really have an Elia the Alabaster. Even Elda, King of the Lions, who is kind of supposed to be at that power level, supposed to be bringing that to water, he kind of fails, even though he does make up for the incredible weakness to physical. He is quite physically resilient and powerful, and definitely makes up for that disadvantage. And I think that Elda, Glaciella, and Ferris are quite a powerful team together, and maybe one of the best in the game. It's a shame that the rest of the element isn't quite as good, and I don't know, like, do I rate them higher than Lightning? I don't know, because they have a lot of the similar issues, even though they're kind of staging a comeback more recently. Oof. Yeah, no, they have some problems. I think 6 out of 10 is perfect for them as well. Another one that I'm not particularly a fan of is Fire. Now, oh man, this might actually be the first to go below 5. So let me be positive here first. There's a lot of really good limited options here. Shalza Ovis is an incredible support. She doesn't really have many ways of dealing damage, but she supports incredibly well and works really well on a number of teams. Kamral is hands down maybe one of my favorite new free units. He's also one of the newest free MR units, but he has the ability to do a lot of damage on the right team. He has courage in his kit, so that's important compared to some other characters that don't have any form of courage. And he has the ability to bestow courage removal as well, which makes him just a real double threat. He gets courage and you don't. How about that? Then Soul's also a very powerful magic user. Unfortunately, his niche is kind of like anti-strike, anti-physical, and while it seems like there would be a lot of that, even running into anti-strike fire teams with my strike team, I often win, even against Soul. And that's saying something, because that's his niche. That's the thing that he's supposed to be able to prevent. Now, full disclosure, I do have a fully reincarnated Perrine, and she's usually the only one that survives, and the one that ends up tapping Soul out. And I guess if this was in guild battle, I wouldn't have a very good round 2 with a half-health Perrine, but Soul, you were supposed to do better than that. Oberon the Auspicious isn't bad, but he's not really anything to write home about. Hio also is a bit of a miss. In order to get back into the heyday, the best that Fire has ever really done, it would be the combination of Sweetheart Ildira, Sorrow, and Yuffie. Now, Yuffie especially is still quite a threat, and if you can't deal with evasion, she is the most evasive and most annoyingly evasive character you will ever face. She even has resilience against guaranteed hit attacks, which make her unhittable by a lot of characters, especially a lot of older characters. And if you're looking for a chink in especially like Lightning's armor, Yuffie is a great way to go. And there was a full evasion team between these three, which isn't strategically the best thing necessarily, but with the way that Sweetheart Ildira's LB works and the way the meta was working at the time, you could really get wombo comboed by all three of these, and also it was possible that you couldn't hit 1, 2, or maybe 3 of them. Mont, King of Leonis, has been an incredible tank for this element since he was first released, and probably a real star. He still does quite good to this day, and his upgrades have been very generous, so he often makes a really good third for this team. So you'll often see like Sorrow, Yuffie, and King Mont. But that was really like the peak for Fire, and it was doing really good at that peak. I would say if I had made this rating then, I would probably have to give them like a 6 or a 7 at that time, because I mean, you can see already that if you have a strong evasion strategy in the way that Yuffie does, you can cheese through some things that you really shouldn't be able to beat otherwise. The main issue here is that Mont is already showing his age. He is of all the units that are like relevant right now, that I've talked about, he is definitely the oldest. Sorrow also is released before the reincarnation system, and he is currently capped at 120, and it's probably going to be like 3 more years before we see the Dragon Quest collaboration come back, and this guy get a 140, or maybe even like a 160, because 3 years from now, 120 is going to cut it even less. So the future for this guy is not at all bright, even though there was a point where he was absolutely the star of the element. And, you know, he made a really good partner with Yuffie, and as a 120 unit, he lasted farther into the 140 meta than most have. But we've kind of moved away from some of that, and there are more and more newer characters that can deal with evasion. And also, you know, Yuffie's main credit was that she was a really evasive unit that also had guaranteed hit evasion, and at the time there weren't a lot of characters that had, like, increased accuracy attacks. Everything for dealing with evasion was based around guaranteed hit, so her ability to dodge guaranteed hit while still having a respectable evasion set, because a lot of the guaranteed hit avoiders aren't necessarily that evasive anyways, so it's not super scary with them. She's the one it's actually scary with. That being said, since her release, there have been a lot of characters like, I don't know, King Bradley being a really good example, that are baseline pretty accurate, but also have increased accuracy attacks as well, that really deal with both sides of her evasion. They don't need guarantee hit, and most of the time they don't even have it anymore. So a lot of those characters can counter Yuffie, and, you know, if you can hit her, she's not nearly the problem that she is if you can't. It is really a matter of her being able to dodge more reliably than any other character in the game in most scenarios. And if she isn't doing that, she isn't nearly as good. So because of that, I think I have to give this whole element 5 out of 10, I think. Next, we're going to move on to Ice. So Ice has actually gotten a number of interesting units recently. I like Howlett, Reagan, Jaden. Those 3 are all pretty good. But there hasn't been a lot of like recent stuff for Ice. Ice characters tend to be a bit, let's say, not resilient to damage in general. They're kind of fragile, much like you would imagine Ice being, but typically they tend to be able to shield themselves, like, I don't know, maybe a shield of ice. So they tend to base themselves around shields and that type of protection. They also, for a period, were very heavily based in ranged damage, and this time was quite cool. This is a very powerful team, especially with Snow or with Velis. Like, Alaya Rundle just made this work for them. Kind of both times Alaya has come out, she's definitely redefined the element that she came out in a way. So, you know, she was good then, but especially with newer characters getting a little bit more range and a little bit more sturdiness, it doesn't work to be a little bit further away anymore. That doesn't give you an extra hit, and ranged units tend to need an extra hit to compete. And Alaya and Eliza tend to fall to 1 hit themselves. So once you get in range, the fight's over with them, and that's really unfortunate. There are some maps that they can still take advantage of, but that's a bit of an issue. Jaden, Howlett, and Reagan, thankfully, are a lot more close range and a lot more resilient, a lot more naturally resilient too. Like, they have a lot more layers of resiliency than just barriers, even though I think all 3 characters do utilize barriers. And now, I've played up the whole barrier angle a lot because A2 has the ability to bestow bestow barrier protection, and this is super important for ice. I don't think I've seen an ice team since A2 came out that didn't have A2 on it, and in addition to that, I often see A2 put on water teams as well. Like, A2 gets used a lot to protect barriers across multiple elements. Now, naturally, ice being the element that has the most barriers, and her being an ice unit, this is her most natural fit. And unlike units like Helena the Black Rose or Vivi, I'm not really going to dock her for being on other elemental teams because I think she fits in perfectly with ice and that everything else is just added benefit for her. That being said, I think the protection sealing abilities don't tend to work very well, unfortunately. There's a lot of hype for them, but you tend to get hit before you can seal things. It just takes one too many steps to counter something that typically doesn't take many steps at all. So that's kind of unfortunate. There's also kind of a lack of super new units here. I guess Jaden is pretty new. Howlett and Reagan were towards the end of the era before that, so they feel kind of in between. But often if I can't find a lightning team to pick on, historically I've picked on ice instead. And I'm not a fire player, so I never play the elemental advantage against this one. Now, I do regularly hunt lightning teams with my earth team, but in my experience, especially if you have barrier breaking skills, it's not super hard to beat an ice team. They typically go down pretty easy. That being said, they can still be formidable, and you do want to watch out for the range, but if you can deal with those things, ice is easy to handle. That being said, though, I think I'm going to give it a 6. I'm going to rate it currently. Damn. Do I give it a 6, though? I guess I give it a 6. I don't know. Man, I really should have ranked some of the first ones a little bit higher to give myself a little bit more room to differentiate these without pushing fire to 1 star. Yeah, maybe 5. Maybe 5. We'll say 5. I think they've got maybe more going for them now. No, okay, we'll go with 6. We'll rank them the same as lightning and water. Fine. Okay, wind. Next up, wind. Wind actually... Okay, so wind has had a really interesting history within War of the Visions. First, it was a powerful element if you could afford it, because everything good about it was limited. Kind of like how I just noted that Dark has a similar issue where everything good is limited in their element. I mean, there were just some really bad units released for Wind. Although I am definitely looking at you. Love your voice acting, but not a good unit, and hopefully new Aldoa is awesome. But units like 2B, Halloween Little Leela, Tifa, that kind of thing, like Winter Luartha, and then Joom, even. All of these were standout characters, but they were all limited. So then, starting with Soddly and then Glaciella, the wind elements started getting more non-limited characters that were, I mean, top of their class. Like, these are both very good characters and remain so to this day. And I know that I had to scroll down a little bit lower to get to these two than some of the other things that I have talked highly about, but when they came out, they were standout units. I mean, Soddly and Glaciella and Joom together, and Joom isn't super limited. Like, you know, the Another Story units are only so limited compared to other things. They're the least limited of limited units. So I would say that between those three, it's basically a non-limited team that, I mean, this was the point where Wind started being able to reliably beat Ice. Even the Ice ranged was starting to fall apart. And a big part of that is just Glaciella's range and durability. Like, she is a tough lady to beat, and Soddly is absolutely a curveball that can ruin most, if any, team if he just hits them right. So this team was very, very good back in the day, and honestly, since it's been updated, I've been beat by this team a couple of times. Like, it's still very good, but not quite there. So we've got to supplement this with newer characters. Unfortunately, Resol was not that good, and that's all they really got for another story version 2. Edward Elric was a free unit, which is awesome for him. Also quite powerful. He really serves better on strike teams, though. He's more of a curveball for strike teams. Most people think about Earth as a way to counter strike because of the power of Elia the Alabaster. So throwing an Edward Elric on your Elia team is just a really good way to screw with Earth players. That being said, he doesn't have courage, and while he does do a lot of damage, does have a lot of tech, does have a lot of interesting things about him, and was free. I mean, he was one of the last people to get kicked off of my strike team. I'll be fair, okay? This guy had a good run. But unfortunately, I've removed him for Comral, because compared to Edward, Comral has two distinct advantages, that being that he has courage and won't get one-tapped like Edward sometimes can, although Edward has pretty interesting resistances, but also that he can remove courage, another thing that Edward can't do in the same way. So I really feel like Comral, especially in limited content, is just a good upgrade. Edward is still pretty good for Wind if you have him. I wouldn't expect to see him re-released anytime soon, although oh wait, Dragon Quest is a Square Enix property as well, and so is Nier. Okay, well, yeah, I don't think we're going to be seeing this guy coming back anytime soon for an update, so his chances of being amazing in the future are probably pretty low. Lena was a bit underwhelming. She was essentially a lower cost Sodali that didn't have the offensive options and also didn't really have the status. She is in some ways a better healer, but that's kind of all she does. I guess you could call this girl an improvement to Ayaka, but do you want to see how far down we have to scroll to get to Ayaka? That far. Basically to the bottom. Zidane is actually a pretty powerful character. I wouldn't say that he's anywhere near as good as Vivi. Again, I don't think that like the sealing skills are amazing, and he does have courage sealing, so he can protect other units' courage. He also has some lancing skills in his sub-job, which means he can play with Veritas of the Heavens, Glaciella. Also, Glaciella being a great unit that holds up to this day really pairs her well with Veritas of the Heavens, and compared to Veritas of the Waters, Veritas of the Heavens is very easy to get and build up, and is also getting like fully upgraded before Veritas of the Waters, before most people even have Veritas of the Waters, let's put it that way. So, you know, you're going to have this guy in 120 before you have Veritas of the Waters at 1, and I think that that's definitely a boon for him. He's also kind of the core of a newer Wind team. He's also very good on Pierce teams, but really I think the biggest core of what Wind is doing is unfortunately stuck in the past with the Sodali Glaciella combo. There are some new things that have tried to shake that up. Edward was a really good choice for this. Zidane was a pretty interesting one for this. Veritas of the Heavens, adding in more Pierce synergy with Glaciella also seems pretty cool, but Rissol just kind of missed the mark in that she doesn't synergize well with the rest of basically anything for Wind. Edward, as I pointed out earlier, has better synergies on... God, dog. Edward has better synergies on strike teams than on Wind, so I gotta dock some points for that. And I don't know. I don't think I need to dock points for Zidane, but he's just not as good as Vivi is. So this element is unfortunately a bit stuck in the past. As I've said before, I do think there's a chance at an interesting future, but currently it's built around their Veritas, and While that is a unique advantage at the moment, every element will be getting a Veritas, and that's really going to even the playing field. Also, I would expect that the Veritas will get a little bit stronger as they continue to come out, so him being the first Veritas to be released is also kind of a long-term bad omen for his place on win teams. But still, pretty cool character and definitely one of the big parts of what's making Wind good now. And despite the fact that I said that it's stuck in the past, part of that is because it hasn't needed... I mean, there was kind of an awkward period where Sodley and Glaciella were stuck at 120 and were still usable, but since they've got their 140 back, they've kind of resumed being the best Wind characters. And sure, maybe you use one or two newer characters with them, but they're still absolutely the core. Oh yeah, and Lena, I mean, again, Sodley, but more limited. And that's just... I know Sodley's a good character, but if you're a Wind player, you've already built him, so why would you downgrade to Lena? Why? That being said, I think that there's probably more potential here, but also more potential for that potential to age poorly. Okay. Two things. I'm giving Wind 7 out of 10. I'm moving Light to 9 out of 10, and I'm moving Dark to 8 out of 10, just to create a little bit of space between them. Still think that Light and Dark are better, and that Light is a little bit better than Dark as well, because it's not as limited, and also, like, a lot of it's free. It's kind of the opposite in that respect. I almost want to give it a 10, but it has seen better days. And Dark's pretty strong, but similar issues there. Then we're moving into Earth. Earth is an element that I've really liked for a while. I think that Earth is very strong. I've been playing Earth Evasion for quite some time, which recently got a new update with Lucio. I kind of famously took a stand against Lucio and talked about why I didn't want to pull him. But if you were a newer player at that time, and this was my advice then, definitely a great way to get into Earth Evasion. But I run, like, this is going to be one of the few times that I really dive deep into one of these lists for characters I still use. But Zazan the Unkillable is still... He hits the other side of the field way before my other units do, which can be a bit of a problem for him sometimes. But usually he'll take out one or two of the other characters while taking a little bit of damage. And, you know, he's bodied half of their team by the time the healer catches up to heal him. Often this team will end up fully healed at the end of its shenanigans, and that's fighting a lot of different teams. But I can always just target a lightning team, because this guy is just the perfect intersection of things to screw over lightning now and into the future if they don't improve their accuracy. That being said, you definitely want newer characters to support them, and I would say that a big part of Earth's power is based around King Bradley, even to this day, which is kind of unfortunate because he's limited and we're probably not seeing this collaboration again anytime soon. Also, if you've been playing recently, there's a number of really neat healers. These two especially. Earth didn't have healers for the longest time, and now it's kind of absurd what they can do now that they have them. It was really holding them back, but now they've caught up, and that has really increased their station, I would say. Galzak being incredibly powerful limited healer, basically Velis for half the cost and free to build, pretty excellent. Then we've got Rinoa. Rinoa is a lot more of a support and healer. She's a lot more of the 90 cost version of Galzak, and she was the free unit, I think, for that collaboration. And then we got another free unit in Dagger, who also does have heals, but is a lot more focused on the damage end of things. And personally, like, I think Rinoa maybe has too many heals. Earth is just resilient enough as it is that I don't need Galzak or Rinoa. I've been having a lot of fun running Dagger because the heals that she does have are enough, and she pumps out more damage when she does, so that's cool. There's another... I mean, Uriel's a really strong strike unit here. She's often a curveball to screw with a lot of the Alabaster teams. She also makes a really good combination with Elia the Alabaster to fight other Elia teams. Dialdo is one of the strongest tanks in the game. He's right up there with Raph and maybe a little bit below Summer Glaciella. Very powerful though. And he's so resilient that if you pair him with a healer, he may never die. Pretty excellent unit there, and really, really, really stubborn to deal with, although not necessarily the best offensively, and also needs a little bit of healing support, I think, in some ways, but once you set him up, he's amazing. Melnia and Rulgia, I'm not a big fan of either of these. I don't, as I've said, like ranged units so much in this year of our Lord FFBE, but this is a good range team. And then we've got 2P as well. While she is a limited unit and not one that I've really looked too hard at, she is pretty powerful. She is a pretty solid unit and also makes a really good combination with Uriel. So you have essentially an Earth Strike team here as well that's quite powerful. In the way that, like, you know, I wasn't willing to give water points for Perrine. I wasn't willing to give wind points for Edward. I may have even docked some points for Elia from Lightning, but even though they have more synergies and more people that they could pair into this, because you don't have a third, like, Earth Strike unit here. But the fact that this synergy is here means that it could be viable. I don't have to knock as many points for that. Although, there's a lot of limited units up here, and I would say that if you weren't playing for King Bradley and don't have him, then your Earth team is definitely going to suffer. Although, I guess Dialdo plus a healer could be a pretty good core to run one of these other units on. There's some cool options here. Also, Mashari Queen of Horn is pretty powerful. A lot of good stuff here. I think I'm going to give Earth also a 7. It was an element that was maybe a bit downtrodden for a while, and I think a lot of people, even to this day, underestimate, but oh boy, Earth really does well and really does amazingly in its own little niche of countering lightning, especially as Elia starts to get out of hand. It can be really, really good for that as well. So that's it. That's the elemental rankings in a nutshell, all in just under an hour. So thank you so much for watching a video that was this long to begin with, but also, since you're still here, please like and subscribe. You made it all the way to the end. I'm proud of you, and show me a little bit of respect by doing that. Also, if you want some more Jackie Fox, there's a link in the description to more stuff that I do online. I would be very happy to see you there, to see you click on that link. But that little beep says that it's now almost 4 o'clock, so I gotta get to guild battle and beat some suckers' faces in. But hopefully with the advice that I've given you so far, you have a better handle on the elements, how they work against each other, how you should play them, or what you should maybe be pulling for or hoping for. With all of that being said, I hope you get to a place where you're busting some faces in guild battle pretty soon. And with all that being said, I'll see you in the next one.